Is Friday, September 22nd, 2017, and this is the Construction Progress Coalition Friday call-in. Today we're going to be talking about the Open Integration Summit we had on August 2nd about solving the RFI dilemma. We're going to go through some of the graphics that I've pieced together, and I apologize in advance for some of the crudeness of them. Our designer, Becky, who's going to be doing them all professionally for the formal report, is down in South Florida and is a little bit delayed with all the weather they're having down there. At the end of this, we will be having a good discussion, hopefully, based on the topics that we go through. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So before we get started, I want to give a real quick background on the progress that we've made with our partnership with the Construction Open Standards Alliance, COSA. This really idea of working together with Tom Stem and Benny Beltrowski and others to be better together, representing both industry and technology partners. Just recently, last week, we confirmed our 9 board of directors. You can see them here from left to right is Farah Francis, with the CIO for AGC. We have Damon Hernandez with the AEC Hackathon. Alan Engel, who with JLL, who's been a current vice president of CP Coalition and has been with us since the beginning. You can see myself there, and Tom Stem as president and VP will sit as board members and also executive officers. And then along we go Sasha Reed from Bluebeam, as I'm sure all of you know. Frank Moore from Autodesk, who's been a great supporter in the last year or two with the CP Coalition efforts. Dennis with Sage, who has been a huge supporter for COSA for a long time, and Benny Beltrowski, who is one of the co-founders of COSA. So next steps on the formal side, we will be issuing out, so look for an email of those interested in any one of these executive chair positions for either the reports, like this RFI report that we're doing right here, or the PDF guidelines, standards, which will be in charge of updating COSA standards as we go through the process. Events, the hosting of these OI summits, Friday call-ins, those sorts. Membership chair is pretty self-explanatory. Communication as far as social media and keeping everything tied together. And then we'll have a treasurer. So do keep an eye out for those. Looking to get those out early October, have applications back by the end of October so that we can get the board together on November 7th and vote in those positions and continue on our way. So speaking of kind of the renewed purpose of the joint efforts between CP Coalition and COSA, if we sort of look from the top left and go clockwise here, we start with identifying the different digital dilemmas. You know, it started with the PDF guidelines, for those of you who remember Construction PDF Coalition. Now we're dealing with RFIs, and we want to continue this process through submittals, daily reports, you know, whatever are those low-hanging fruit digital collaboration challenges, and get them into one of these open integration summits like we just had. Really uncover and digest the different angles of the dilemma and what are some of the recommendations from technology and industry to solve those. That will then, with this RFI report as well, will flow into an updated COSA standard. So the COSA standard for RFIs does exist. It's fairly good, but needs to be updated. So that will be the next step. And then finally, similar to the PDF guidelines, we'll create an RFI guidelines, which is really intended to be used at the project level by project teams, similar to like a BIM execution plan or anything like that, to decide at the RFI level what needs to be done. But without further, we want to jump now into the Open Integration Summit itself. So you can see here, huge thanks to all the sponsors. Obviously, this event would not have happened without their help and support. Our thought leadership sponsors are Procore and Autodesk, breakout sponsors, BuilderBox, Lori again doing double duty, Bluebeam, and OnTarget. Our participant sponsors, we had Sage, DeWalt, NoteVault, Pavia Systems, eSub, 8 Mobile out of Australia, which is great to have them out, and Rumix. Integration services, Tom with Rivet, myself with Spectrum AEC, and we had someone from Faction IT, which is really interesting to see sort of the IT integration services that is newer to this industry, but a rapidly growing service. Really quickly, just the breakdown of who was there. We had a pretty even balance of industry and technology, sort of from left to right. You can sort of see some of the folks here: Cody Noah, Connor Christian, Ben Crosby, others. A lot of notable faces here, those that are kind of respected in the industry, and on the technology side as well. You know, but those who are definitely at the top of their game, either at the C-suite level or at the senior integrations level. So very, very intense debate that we had throughout the day. Very productive debate. So diving into what we actually talked about, we went through this digest, debate, decide process as we do with the CP Coalition. And it started with what is an RFI and why should I or why should anyone care? We brought up some stats from this Navigant report. And really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about and what all of this is about is trying to get to this digital collaboration utopia, whether it's PDFs, whether it's BIM, whether it's RFIs. This is the holy grail of what we're trying to get to, of this easy exchange between our individual company databases and this sort of single source of truth project database. But again, it is a utopia. So the reality and what we were talking about and what we knew we needed to face during the day was the fact that we have a 9.7 average day for response, mainly because the contract requirement is 10 days. So, ask me how I'm measured and I'll tell you how I behave is sort of the logic there. And these RFIs are very costly. Each RFI costs about $10,000 or over $1,000. So you multiply that by 900 RFIs on an average job, it's over $100,000. And the really scary thing is how many of these RFIs just never get responded to because of legal risk, because of other things. This is just really poor data that's not going to help the industry get better. So after we broke that down, Ben Crosby from Yates did a great job talking about really the impact that BIM and virtual design and construction has done to transform the RFI and sort of how we think about the RFI. And he was really breaking down the fundamental difference between design and construction. This idea of an efficient and effective design today, for those of you who are familiar with design thinking or Agile or Scrum or even a lot of the parts of Lean, it's very action-centric, and it's the pull mentality of pulling from priorities, whereas the sort of natural gravity, as Ben was alluding to, and material science leads that construction needs to have a much more linear flow. It can't be this design thinking action-centric. So that's really the dilemma happens at this boundary of realization. And just some background, the boundary of realization itself does come from a Lean academic paper that was presented by Laurie Spittler from Autodesk on the 4-phase project delivery. You can see them here. It's pretty simple. For those who understand the V model of systems engineering, it very much mirrors that. But the simplistic idea here is that we should be moving all RFIs before this boundary of realization, before we start hammer and nails and fabrication and moving forward with those items. And with VDC and BIM, we have the ability to do that. So that's the concept of what we're getting towards. Some who are from the industry have probably seen this, the McLeany curve of a cost influence curve, again, showing that the earlier we have these RFIs, the better they are. We don't need to demonize RFIs, we just need to move them earlier. But what we came down to is there's a fundamental difference in the way that a lot of projects deliver. And some projects deliver in a more integrated way through design build or through IPD, and some are the more traditional way. And there's a big difference in the who and the how between these two. So it's hard to create standards when it comes to RFI collaboration. And that was a big topic that we hit on in the morning. So Connor Christian came and he was talking about the government, his side from the sort of federal experience. And we talked a lot about the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction and their role in all of this. And how at the government side, there's a difference between a government off-the-shelf system that sort of requires a custom integration within their system, very manual, sort of the old school, versus this commercial off-the-shelf that if you're fortunate enough to get certification through FedRAMP, you can then have this much more direct exchange. It's sort of the next step, but it's not very well known about. Not too many companies are certified on it yet, so we need to move forward with that as an industry. The final sort of dilemma and digest portion was Todd Sutton from Zachary, and he has a vast experience in open data standards and comes from the civil side. And he was hitting on really just the impact of interoperability and the challenges and the cost of interoperability, which is really why we're all here in the first place, is to try and solve this $15.8 billion dilemma of interoperability between architects, contractors, trade contractors, and the ultimate operator of the building. He did do a quick breakdown. You can sort of see a timeline here of all the different standards that, it's not for lack of standards. There certainly are plenty of open standards that have existed. It's more the adoption and the integration of them that has been the challenge. And that was kind of the summary of a lot of Todd's message from this. And then finally, we want to end on a positive note from the industry side. So we had Cody Nowak with Disrupt AUC, and he was showing off some pretty cool HoloLens examples of really the early concepts that Trimble had mocked up of what would an RFI in the field being solved through augmented reality look like, and showed a really cool proof of concept. So it's always nice to know that that technology is there, and it's really up to us as industry to define those standards so that we can connect all of that data through and take advantage of it. All right, 1 second here. So that finished up the early morning section. The next section we went through was the debate section. We had 3 presenters. First one here was Lori Spittler from Autodesk. So she did a really great presentation breaking down, again, the design process dilemma. And you can see here, again, coming back to the challenge with contracts, what she was trying to define and help us in the room come to an agreement on is, what is the difference between a formal and an informal communication? Because so much of this is that problems happen, a lot of times it's phone calls, communications, and problems get solved, and we don't document that information that is so critical for us to learn as an industry to get better. So a lot of this, anytime you see those red dashed lines, those are basically saying people want to be talking to each other to solve problems more efficiently, but the contract does not allow them to, or it's at risk if they do so. And so how do we get to more of the design build, more of the IPD contracts that are incentivizing and encouraging this sort of informal communication and having that earlier on in the process? So here's sort of a markup of that original McLeamy curve, and noting that we're still going to have sort of the integrated, and we're still going to have traditional contract models, but maybe if we rethink it as sort of what is the formal delivery process that usually deals with the authority having jurisdiction or government or whatever that body is, and then the informal being everything that we can talk about before we hit that point, and trying to have encourage more informal issues, more of that tracking to reduce the number of RFIs, and then ultimately hopefully eliminate any change order processing. And another discussion is, as we talked about, the fact that that ideal boundary of realization is never really a straight line. It's always sort of a curved line like that. And there's actually 2 boundaries of realization if we want to break down informal versus formal. So a lot of sort of language and ideas here for us to talk through and try and help us really redefine both contracts and process and the technology standard. So moving from process into technology, Charles Julius from Procore really broke down their experience with open APIs and integrations and what they've done so far. So this became an interesting conversation. If anybody's on the call wants to chime in, by all means, please do. But this sort of mess of a modification of that original utopia of the digital collaboration reality, if you look just at the legend at the bottom, you see the difference between an internal integration and an external exchange. And an integration is always going to be a one-way pull, either from a tool or an app or a database, and it's going to be going into your system for your historical tracking or metrics or whatever that is. So you see that the internal integration, really that's a lot of the needs and demands that the industry is telling technology, that they're telling Procore, they're telling others, hey, we want more of this internal integration. Whereas a lot of the folks and a lot of the purpose of CP Coalition from the get-go with PDS was, well, we want more of these informal exchanges and formal exchanges to be standardized between companies and between databases. So again, the better we can understand who is talking to who, is it formal, is it informal, and from a technology side, understanding the difference between an integration that can be automated and sort of done overnight versus an exchange that actually has to be sort of actionable, and RFI is a great example of an exchange. All right, so even if we were to fix the process perfectly and fix all the technology, there's still the whole motivation and addressing the people side of what's in it for me. So Chris Langiza from Styles did a great job of breaking down the different perspectives, and there's a sort of the updated graphic of what's in it for me here. You see from the bottom, the data producers, those, whether they're engineers, trade contractors, are really all about the individual efficiency. Just make it easier for me. That's why products are so successful, that develop really intuitive apps. But that needs to get up to the next level, where it's also a very simple setup for project managers, and it can be easily customizable. So there's a new perspective at the project manager level that has to be addressed. As we move our way up the chain, we also have project executives that their interest is, well, we want reliable data, and we want it to not cost a lot of money, because we traditionally haven't spent very much on technology in this industry. So that's going to be their perspective. And then at the very top is the AHJ again. And at the end of the day, as Connor Christian was doing a great job explaining, their job is not efficiency, it's reliability, and it needs to be fail-safe. So they should be not necessarily a bottleneck, but they should be a filter. And how we work with government is extremely important. All right, so let's get into what we actually came out with and what we decided. So what we came together in these breakout groups. The first breakout group was focused on addressing contract language and the contract standards based on this new idea of what is an informal issue, a formal RFI, or sort of a public or a owner level change order. And you can see here that each of these would ideally be elevated, that an informal issue has data, has things tied to it that could be a punch list item, it could be just a change in the sequence to a logistics plan, but we want to track those sorts of items. And if for some reason down the road that becomes an issue, we can then take that information and elevate that up to a formal RFI, where it would be tracked more in the project level database. And then again, if any of those items that were changed then had either a cost impact, a schedule impact, or had a change to the permitted drawing set, if they were already permitted, then that would elevate that up to a public change. So this would be stuff that, again, as we move towards the guidelines, we'll actually try and put in sample contract language for people to copy paste into owner contracts. For right now, we're just trying to communicate this idea of separating these tiers of 1, 2, and 3. So the other group that worked very much in conjunction with the contract standards group was the data standards group, because at the end of the day, we need to have close alignment in these new exchanges. So as we again talk about data exchanges at different levels and keep this idea of 3-tiered concept, you'll see that a tier 1 exchange would be all the information, all the data that is held, you see in that informal issue, tied up into and referenced through the reference issue ID to the formal RFI. That formal RFI, if that needed to go up to a tier 3, then it would go, it would go through the tier 2 exchange to get up to tier 3, and then tier 3 exchange would be going into the owner's database or the AHJ's database. But again, you see the difference between the integrations, because any of those dump outs into that company database is that one-way tier 1 integration, tier 2 integration, tier 3 integration. So again, interesting to see if this sort of language starts to stick within the technology world, and then we start to adopt it within the contract world as well. The design-driven RFI group here. So we came up with some different process maps and went back and forth a lot after this as well. And if we keep that notion of an informal barrier and a formal barrier, and wanting to keep everything very high level and in that green in the informal area, you can see how many people are involved. Everybody's very much involved in the informal phase in the design, because we want to have as many informal issues and responses tracked and not deal into, again, RFIs or change orders. You see the only difference when you talk about the field-driven RFI group is that you now have this added area of the AHJ approval, which is naturally going to draw things out longer, be more likely you're going to have change order pricing, and just more steps overall, and less people that are likely to identify that field issue, be either the contractor or the trade contractor. So that was a lot, but basically we will be putting out the final report on October 6th. So look forward to sending that out to everybody with all of the formal branding and sponsorship logos and all of that. We are still looking for review and comment. The actual write-up that associates my very lengthy explanation of all those graphics is available at this bit.ly right here, bit.ly/RFI report. And we do encourage, comments to come in, any thoughts as we're wrapping this up, and looking forward to put it out. And it will just be a free document for those in the industry to reference, to share, to hopefully use at presentations, and continue to drive this language of redefining RFIs moving forward. So with that, I think that was the questions that I had. I'm curious, I have a quick poll since we have about 21 folks on, which is great. I want to launch this poll real quick just to find out who we have here. Because again, we're really trying to bring together all these different perspectives of architect, engineer, GC, facility operators, owners, either technology product side or technology on the service side. So it looks like we're about, I'll give it a couple seconds here. Let's see how we do. Okay, good. All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll. So it looks like, oops, I'll share the results here. Okay, so the highest was technology product and general contractor, which is great. That's really where we started from as CP Coalition with GCs and Bluebeam back in 2013. So with that, I guess I'm curious with those who are on the call. We don't have to go necessarily down the line, but I do see Tom's on. Anything you want to add in there, Tom?
No, nothing too specific. I think you did a really good job of covering the process that we kind of went through, how the day unfolded, the types of conversations that we had. Devil's in the details, obviously. There's a lot of depth to each of the discussion points that Nathan walked through in terms of when each of the different breakouts, each of the different information shares, et cetera. So I think in terms of what we kind of come out with the report, the one thing I'd like to just highlight from a what happens next perspective is that the report that comes out of this is not meant to necessarily be the end-all solution. It's really meant to set the foundation for how we devise the solution for what comes next. And that's where we'll take the existing RFI standard from COSA and begin to repurpose and evolve it in terms of being able to sort of meet the challenge in a more dynamic way. I think one of the things that is becoming a sort of common thread, especially on the technology side of the fence, is the need to establish more flexibility in terms of how we think about standards, how we think about digitizing data, and then how we think about making that data accessible and then moving that data around. Whether it's internal, as Nathan mentioned, from a organization-centric perspective, or even amongst many participants that are working together and collaborating to deliver project outcomes within a single project. So no, I think I'm really interested to sort of see what happens next and to see how the different audiences on the call help engage with us to kind of help us drive forward with next steps, provide feedback to the report, but then also participate in what we want to do next, which is really taking sort of the description of the problem at large, and then therefore the opportunities that exist to kind of drive that back out through, here's how we can think about technology standards, and then here's how we can think about some of the different concepts that we're presenting here in terms of creating some more refined and specific guidelines to basically capture all of this information and pull it back into the actual day-to-day operations of companies that are out in the field. So I'll kind of leave it at that for now, I suppose.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Tom. I saw Neuron's on as well, and I know, Neuron, you're leading the field group, and one of the points you're making about this digitize, standardize, and optimize, I think that really is kind of the message at the end of the day of this three-step process. Do you want to explain a little bit more about what you guys were talking about as far as what needs to be done on that side? If you're not muted. Oh. We can't hear you, Neuron. We'll come back to you. Anyone else that was there that attended that wants to add any thoughts or clarifications or questions? Man, did you guys have a late Thursday night? Everybody hungover? I
I
see.
see.
So,
So,
David,
David,
how would
how
this
would this
fit
fit
into
in?
the lead side of the world? Do you ever think of tiers of like informal tracking of lead issues that if something's mistaken, then it elevates to the next level? Do you guys have anything currently within the lead language that does that?
I'm not sure what's evolved. Like, as soon as you said lead, I was like, oh yeah, that's what I was doing
I
before
know.
Bluebeam, and being 3 years out of the game now, and with lead version 4 now being done, I'm not sure if there's been any significant changes, but I think a lot of the issues that did arise were usually informal. Like you showed a graphic there with exchange of information, which ones would be formal, which ones would be informal.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly you'd have the informal exchange between engineering firm and architect, but also engineering firm and contractor in my case, and it was more of an advisory role. So I think
I mean, I don't think they're. I never found any way to do that, but I feel like that's another opportunity for these sorts of, again, establishing tiers. I think it's really the only way that we're going to be able to blend. This kit of parts was another term that kind of came out of the day of what is a kit of parts standard that is based on a fundamental baseline. We use that term minimum data exchange. That hopefully we can get both industry and technology on the same page on. That is a flexible enough baseline to then adapt to all the different individual needs of different projects. Because I mean, this is the same challenge we were facing with PDF guidelines, because there were so many decisions that need to be made at the project level, and it's hard to create a standard that easily applies to every single project level.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts? I am curious. Hopefully, Mark doesn't mind if I pick out a little bit, but I know he presented at the pre-extreme meeting from the owner's perspective of just implementing standards in general. I'm curious if you're able to provide any thoughts or comments from the owner's perspective of like, is this crazy talk? How close would this be to shifting contracts and trying to get at a public level, the tiered levels of data exchange?
So for this, well, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So for this, it's kind of a little bit further than we're diving right now. We're just trying to get the ball rolling. So I think it's good information on where it's going, and I'm glad that everybody else in the world's ahead of us right now, so that we can kind of ride the coattails of the whole process. So
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like, why would the facility operator need to be in the construction kickoff meeting? It's like, well, he doesn't really, but there are certain things that's nice for him to be aware of it. So it's almost like, yeah, this stuff is way down there. And I don't know if you're on in the beginning when we talked about this sort of 3-step phase here. We're just in step 1 here, whereas we need to develop an actual COSA standard that we can then have technology adopting, and then we'll have guidelines for projects to implement similar to those PDF guidelines. So you're totally right. I mean, the PDFs and everything we're doing on that side is over here, whereas RFIs, we're still back here, so we got some steps to go.
Yeah, and it's perfect. And being a part of this, it's really interesting. I got a call from DSA earlier this week, and how they're implementing Bluebeam Studio for their design review, and they want to hear from owners to kind of push the process. And that was a big hurdle that I saw for DSA, because they scan everything, and once you scan everything, it basically breaks. And now that they're on board, I think that's going to be a big push for the public schools sector, especially in SoCal, to really push the same way. So.
Yeah. And that's a great example. The Bluebeam Studio is a perfect example of, informal data that gets captured in those markups that can easily be ported out and used for analytics and efficiencies and other things, and try and have as many things solved up there. And only when it gets to that next level would you, record it as a formal RFI. And it was very interesting to see. I think we all want that, and it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg I think discussion. So as long as both sides are working towards changing the traditional way that we go through, design, permitting, and release for construction, and being more agile, I think that's the ultimate goal that we're trying to do here.
Yeah, it's definitely good, and I'm sharing all the little snippets of information we get from these presentations and various other ones with our architects and general contractors and construction managers, trying to get everybody on board, because that's kind of what it takes. So.
And you know what, is after seeing your presentation where you're using a lot of the same design assets that we had, I think we may just, open source the assets. So once the more professional version of these we'll just have the actual, PNG files downloadable. Anybody can throw them in presentations, throw them in documents. We want to try and democratize the language of what we should be doing, so that it sort of seeps its way into contracts and data standards, and kickoff guidelines.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, no, thank you. Anyone else want to provide any thoughts or input? Ruben, you've been quiet.
Reading information. So
okay.
I think it looks great. Can't wait to see the updated graphics that you're teasing. Assuming they can unbury themselves from the Florida storms, but this is excellent. This is really good.
Awesome, thank you. All right. Well, I know everybody is, I'm sure, very busy. If nobody else has any other thoughts or comments, I will be. Again, we'll be recording all of this.